Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. Ready to explore a real medical head scratcher. Today, we're going to tackle something called Cannabinoid Hyperemesis syndrome, CHS for short.
Yeah, it kind of turns everything we think we know about cannabis on its head, huh?
Right. I mean, cannabis is often used to, reduce nausea, right? But in this case, prolonged use can actually cause super intense recurring bouts of it.
It's a real paradox.
It really is. So for our listeners, let's break this down. What exactly is CHS?
Well, it's marked by these cyclical episodes, like intense nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. And it hits people who are, chronic cannabis users.
Okay, so it's specifically tied to long-term use. Got it.
Exactly. And there's this weird twist to it. A lot of people with CHS find that they get relief by taking super hot baths or showers.
Hot baths, that's not what you'd expect, right?
Yeah, it's a pretty unique symptom. It's part of what makes CHS so fascinating, I guess. It, challenges our whole understanding of how cannabis interacts with the body.
Makes you wonder what else we might be missing, huh?
Totally. Plus, it was only, first identified in the early 2000s.
Oh, wow. So it's a relatively new condition.
Yeah, relatively speaking. We're still figuring a lot of it out.
Which, makes this deep dive even more interesting for our listeners. They love being on the cutting edge, But how common is CHS? Should people be worried?
That's tough to say for sure. The exact prevalence is still being researched, partly because, CHS is often misdiagnosed. People think it's something else, like a regular stomach bug or something.
And I imagine as cannabis becomes more common, legally and all.
Yeah, we might see more cases. It's hard to say for sure.
So something to keep an eye on for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But let's get to the heart of it. Why does this even happen? Why would cannabis, which is known for, reducing nausea, end up causing such severe episodes of it?
Well, the answer probably lies in this pretty intricate system in our bodies. It's called the endocannabinoid system, or ECS.
ECS.
And basically, it's a network of receptors, enzymes, all these neurochemicals, and it helps regulate a ton of stuff like appetite, mood, pain, and importantly for us, nausea and vomiting.
So it's like this control center keeping things in balance.
Yeah, you could say that. And our bodies actually produce their own kind of cannabis-like molecules. They're called endocannabinoids.
Oh, wow. We have our own internal cannabis.
In a way, yeah. Things like anandamide and 2-AG. And they bind to those receptors in the ECS to keep everything running smoothly.
So what happens when we add, actual cannabis into the mix, like THC and all that?
Well, that's where things can get a little messy. Introducing those external cannabinoids can disrupt the balance of the ECS, like throwing a wrench in the works, basically.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But how does that disruption actually lead to the symptoms of CHS? Why the nausea specifically?
Well, researchers think a key player here is something called the CB1 receptor.
Okay, CB1 receptor.
And this receptor,
Yeah.
it's found in areas of the brain that are directly involved in controlling nausea and vomiting.
So that's the link.
Yeah.
But why would activating those receptors, which usually help with nausea, end up doing the opposite in CHS?
That's the million-dollar question, right? The current thinking is that it might be down to chronic exposure to THC, especially high doses.
Okay, so too much THC for too long.
Right. And what might be happening is those CB1 receptors become desensitized or even downregulated. They're just not as responsive over time.
Like a dimmer switch that's been turned way down.
Yeah, exactly. And so instead of those receptors effectively controlling nausea, the signal gets all muffled. And that might be why people experience those unbearable episodes.
Like the communication lines get all jumbled up in there.
Exactly.
But wait, what about that hot bath thing? You mentioned that earlier. How does that fit into all this?
Yeah. That's where another type of receptor might come in, the TRPV1 receptor.
TRPV1.
Yeah, and it's involved in sensing heat and pain.
Okay, so heat and pain.
And, get this, cannabinoids can interact with these TRPV1 receptors too.
Oh, wow. So it's not just CB1. So we've got two sets of receptors potentially involved here?
Yeah, potentially. CB1 with nausea, TRPV1 with heat sensation, both maybe getting messed up by chronic cannabis use.
That's a lot to unpack.
It is, but it's a reminder of how much we don't know about, how cannabis affects us.
Yeah, no kidding. This is pretty wild.
There's definitely a lot more research needed, yeah. And it gets even more complicated when you consider the CB1 receptor itself. Turns out there's not just one type of CB1 receptor.
Oh, really? So there's variations.
Yeah, there's actually a bunch of subtypes. They're all CB1, but they have, slightly different roles, and they're found in different parts of the body.
So wait, some are more concentrated in the brain, some in other parts.
Exactly. Some are mostly in the brain, some are like in the peripheral nervous system, the gut, all over.
Okay, so could that be why some people get CHS and others don't? Like maybe they have more of a certain subtype?
That's a great question, and researchers are definitely looking into that. It's possible that, yeah, some CB1 subtypes are just more sensitive to THC, especially over long periods.
So it could be like a genetic predisposition almost.
Potentially, yeah, but we have to remember it's a whole system, right? Not just individual receptors doing their own thing.
Right, right. The whole endocannabinoid system is about balance.
Exactly. It's all connected. And it's about how, you know, chronic cannabis use could be messing with the flow of information within that network.
It's like, well, it's not just about the individual players, it's about how they all work together.
That's a great way to put it. Think of it like an orchestra. Each instrument has its part. But if one instrument's out of tune or like way too loud, it throws everything off.
Yeah, it can ruin the whole performance.
Right. So with CHS, maybe chronic cannabis use, with all that THC flooding the system, it's disrupting the balance, creating that off-key sound, leading to those CHS symptoms.
Okay, so THC is like the off-key trumpet blaring away.
Something like that, yeah. But remember we talked about the entourage effect earlier. That might be playing a role here too.
Oh, right, where all the different compounds in cannabis, they kind of work together.
Exactly. It's not just about THC on its own. It's about, all the other cannabinoids, the terpenes, flavonoids. They all interact with the ECS in different ways, and that could be influencing CHS as well.
So could it be that, like, the specific strain of cannabis someone uses, could that make a difference?
It's possible, yeah. Some early research suggests that that certain compounds in cannabis might actually counteract some of the negative effects of THC. So maybe those could offer a little protection against CHS.
So we'd be choosing specific strains or even different ways of consuming cannabis.
Yeah, that could all play a role. But we need more research to really understand this. But the whole concept of the entourage effect, it just shows how complex cannabis is. It's not as simple as saying THC is good or, CBD is bad. It's about how all these compounds work together and how they're messing with the balance of the endocannabinoid system.
It's about looking at the bigger picture, basically.
Exactly. And speaking of the bigger picture, let's bring this back to like what it means for people who are actually experiencing CHS. Because while we're here talking about molecules and receptors,
right, there are real people dealing with this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's a serious condition, And for a lot of people, it goes undiagnosed or they get misdiagnosed.
I can imagine that must be incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
To be dealing with those symptoms and not knowing what's wrong.
Totally. I mean, people with CHS often end up going through a bunch of tests, and doctors are often looking for other explanations before they even consider cannabis as a factor.
So what can be done to improve the diagnosis process? How can we make sure doctors are aware of CHS? Especially with that hot bath symptom, which seems pretty unusual.
Well, it really comes down to education. We need to make sure healthcare providers know how to recognize CHS early on and how to tell it apart from other conditions that might have similar symptoms. Integrate it into medical school, create clearer guidelines, raise awareness, all of that.
So it's about equipping healthcare providers with the right knowledge.
Exactly. But it's also about, giving patients the information they need so they can advocate for themselves. If you're experiencing those cycles of nausea and vomiting, the abdominal pain, and you're finding relief with hot baths and you use cannabis, you really need to talk to your doctor about it.
So it's about being open and honest with your doctor.
Totally. The more open people are about their cannabis use, the better doctors can understand what might be going on.
Makes sense. The more information they have, the better they can help.
Exactly. It's got to be a two-way street. But this goes beyond the medical community, too. We need to raise awareness in the general public as well.
Yeah, it's about educating everyone, really.
Exactly. We need to, break the stigma around CHS, encourage open conversations about cannabis use, about the risks, about all of it.
Because the more we talk about it, the less people will suffer in silence.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Now, before we move on, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. If CHS is a relatively new condition and we're still researching it, what are the ethical implications of promoting widespread cannabis use, especially for medical purposes, without fully understanding the potential long-term effects?
That's a big question, isn't it? especially with more and more places legalizing cannabis. It's like we're jumping in head first without really knowing what's down there.
Yeah, I mean, millions of people now have access to something that, can have pretty powerful effects on the brain and body, and we're still just scratching the surface of what those effects might be.
It's almost like we're conducting this huge experiment without like a control group or anything.
That's a good way to put it.
So we really need those long-term studies, right, to see how cannabis use, both recreational and medical, affects people down the line.
Absolutely. We need data on everything. Cognitive effects, mental health, addiction potential, the whole 9 yards. Especially for, people who might be more vulnerable, like teenagers or people with a history of substance abuse.
Right, right. It's not just about like jumping on the bandwagon. It's about understanding the potential downsides too.
Exactly. But we also can't forget about the potential benefits. I mean, cannabis has shown real promise for things like chronic pain, nausea from chemo, multiple sclerosis symptoms, even some types of epilepsy.
So it's this really complex balancing act, right? Exploring the good while acknowledging the bad.
Yeah, it's about finding that sweet spot. And a big part of that is, transparency.
Yeah.
And making sure the research is solid so that both patients and doctors are, making informed decisions.
It's about separating the hype from the actual evidence.
Exactly. And maybe, someday we'll be able to really personalize cannabis treatment based on like your genes, your specific endocannabinoid system, your individual health needs.
So like custom tailored cannabis therapy.
Yeah, something like that. Maximizing the benefits, minimizing the risks. But to get there, we need more research, more collaboration, and more open communication between scientists, doctors, policymakers, everyone.
It's a big challenge, but it could like totally revolutionize healthcare, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a challenge that our listeners, the learners, they're in a great position to tackle this kind of stuff. It's all about digging deeper, questioning assumptions, and never stopping learning.
That's what we're all about here. So to wrap up our deep dive into CHS, we've talked about the symptoms, the possible causes, the tricky diagnosis process, treatment options, how common it is, even the ethical questions that come with it.
We've explored this whole world of the endocannabinoid system, looked at what we know, what we don't know, and hopefully we've gotten everyone thinking about the bigger picture.
And most importantly, we hope we've inspired our listeners to, keep asking questions, stay curious, because there's always more to learn.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.